Martin Scorsese, not Scorsese,
Hey, it's Marty Scorsese.
is a guy whose name is brought up by almost everybody when we start talking about some of the greatest filmmakers to ever do it. And shocker, he is one of my personal favorites. I don't really know what I could add to the conversation when it comes to talking about his legacy, but what I can do is give you all of my hot and not so hot takes when it comes to ranking every movie this guy has ever made. I'm not going to be including documentaries like The Last Waltz, shorts like The Big Shave, or collaborations with other directors like New York Stories. Because without those, this list is still going to go through 26 feature films, and it's gonna be a long one, trust me. If I learned one thing from my Christopher Nolan ranked video, which you could check out after watching this one, it's that some movies can probably be talked about a little bit less than some of the other ones. So some of the lower entries on here will have quicker segments just because you probably haven't heard of some of them for a reason. But just like Nolan, I really don't think Scorsese has ever made a straight up bad movie. Even some of his earliest work isn't that bad, it's just not that good. I know it's obvious, but after watching every single one of these films at least twice, except for Killers of the Flower Moon, I'm still gonna check that out again by the end of the year, this is my list. So comment yours down below, because my favorite thing about doing these videos is seeing how my list compares to yours. Because especially with this one, I think some of my lower picks are probably gonna piss a few people off. But what can I say? Martin Scorsese's 20th best movie would probably be in most directors' top 5. That's just how good this guy is at making movies. Also, if there are some films on here that you haven't seen, just know there will be a couple spoilers every once in a while, but I am going to try my best to avoid as many of them as possible. So if there's a movie you really want to check out but you haven't seen yet and don't want to risk seeing anything about it, there are timestamps in the description to skip to the next entry on the list whenever you feel like it. Because like I said, this video is gonna be a long one. Before we hop into the list though, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, nobody. I'm doing my best here to make these videos as good as possible with the help of my boy Ryan, who is an awesome editor, and you should hit him up absolutely for all of your editing needs. Even though I am the one editing this one, the guy always deserves the shout out anyway, so shout out Ryan. We appreciate all of you guys subscribing and liking the videos so far, both literally and just emotionally. And if we break the algorithm enough, maybe one of these days we will get some sponsorships of our own. So we appreciate everybody that's been watching this early in our journey. So with all of that out of our way, let's go through and rank the films of Martin Scorsese, starting with my least favorite. Again, this list is not objectively ranking what is the most well-made Martin Scorsese movie, because if that was the case, The Age of Innocence would rank much higher on here. It's a beautifully made movie with exquisite costume and set designs, and it's an interesting look at how the class system can affect the life you truly want to live. The ending really does have some weight to it as well, tying this story up in a nice bow, but it is just, it's a snooze fest for me, man. Everybody has different taste, and a period piece romance is probably as far away from my favorite kind of movie as it gets. It just takes a lot of energy for me to get through something like this, and that definitely says more about me than the actual movie, but this is my YouTube channel with my opinions. I'm not gonna act like an elitist and say this is something I could watch every single week. And if a movie with this type of setting and story has a unique enough twist, for example, in this exact case, something like The Favorite, I just get invested in something like that a lot more. But this story is a pretty straightforward one, and it goes pretty much exactly the way you think it will from the beginning, and it is slow. And I like me a slow burn if the payoff is worth it, but for The Age of Innocence, it just doesn't make it that worth it for me. But if this looks right up your alley, I understand why you would have it in your top 5 favorite Scorsese. For those of you panicking that this wasn't in the last spot, there's no need to fear, okay? It wasn't gonna climb the ranks that much higher. I almost feel embarrassed to put it over anything else, because if you have seen it, you just know it's not that great. Even Scorsese himself knows it's not that great.
John Cassavetes was the one who was able to take me, after seeing a rough cut of Boxcar Bertha, it took me into his office and looked at me, and he used to laugh. He used to laugh like, look at me, and he embraced me, and then he pulled me away, and he said, "You just spent a year of your life making a piece of shit. You're better than that stuff. You don't do that again."
But it is the movie that inspired Marty to really go after what he wanted and put him on the path of becoming the legend he is known for now.
He said, "Don't you have something you really want to do?" It turned out to be Mean Streets, had a different title at the time. And he said, "Well, try to get it." I said, "We need some rewrites." "Well, then rewrite it. What are you doing?"
According to Letterboxd, this is the only Roger Corman production I think I've seen so far. I'm sure there's a couple he was involved in that I just don't know of at the moment, but this one didn't really convince me to start binging his filmography anytime soon. Its themes are so on the nose that it feels like it's being told by somebody who hasn't quite figured out how to tell a story on film yet, which totally makes sense considering this was only his second feature ever. But in hindsight, I think it is far from terrible. There are a handful of fun scenes. Barbara Hershey is surprisingly great in the lead role here, considering these types of films weren't known for that kind of thing to begin with, and the scene of a guy getting crucified to a train car will always be burned in my mind. But I have seen this twice now, and I can barely tell you anything else that happens in the story. I feel like this movie is for a very specific type of person.
Marty, condone. I liked it.
It's a movie I find more interesting on paper than what was executed, following the journey of the 14th Dalai Lama in a moonlight fashion structure where we follow him as a child, teenager, and a man. And it's probably a good thing this was made before his old man phase. It's one of those spots in film history where the making of the film is just so much more interesting than the actual movie that we got. China tried to pressure Disney into not even releasing this to the public, and Disney's big response was rubbing it in China's face by putting it out anyway in 2 goddamn theaters, and then pretty much begged China for forgiveness right after. With pretty much no marketing, this thing flopped badly, and it even made China ban Scorsese and many others involved in the project from entering their country for years. Now you can look up all the political reasons as to why this occurred, because that's its own hour-long YouTube video, but I think the only thing really offensive about the movie is that it's just boring. Visually, it's one of his best, for sure, don't get me wrong, but the story was just not captivating enough for me to care about most of the things going on. I thought maybe on a rewatch I would get into it more, but I just couldn't do it. And even though he is known as the mob movie guy, I love when Scorsese dives into the religious side of his work. And I do find it fascinating that he decided to go all in on shedding light on an entire culture that he was completely unfamiliar with. I don't know much about Buddhism myself, so I did at least learn a few interesting things about the religion and its leader here. Like, I think it's crazy how they just pick a child to lead their entire community just from choosing the right items at a table. And there's something about that sequence that always sticks with me for some reason. So to any moron who claims that Scorsese is an old racist who only knows how to make one kind of movie, please go make something like this and cast only people from Tibet like he did. But also, if you're going that route, let them speak their native language rather than broken English accents, because they do that here for some reason, and it's not good. Okay, let's talk about the last not so good Scorsese movie for me. Who's That Knocking at My Door is his first feature film, taking him over 2 years to finish and changing the story up almost 3 different times. It was a film school project, and aside from 3 producers, everybody that worked on the film was under 25 years old. And it definitely feels that way when you watch it. So I think the only reason you should check this out is if you really just want to see everything Scorsese tried to do. And this one really is him trying to figure out how to make a Martin Scorsese movie. In the film's defense, it is genuinely cool to see that a young Marty always had a desire to tell stories about the environment he grew up in. And in that sense, this is probably the most raw version of that place and time besides Mean Streets. And if I'm being honest, I kind of find it crazy that I'm even putting it this high on the list, because it's really not that good. But just like Christopher Nolan's Following, there is a charm, to me at least, as an aspiring filmmaker, to see a director's early work that I could just dig into. It's cool to see that they were never the masters of the craft in the beginning. The main storyline definitely doesn't age the best, that's for damn sure. And it has one of the wildest sex scenes in film history, which feels super off-putting when you're watching it. The crazy thing about it though is that scene is actually the only reason this movie got a distributor in the first place. The scene was not in the original cut, so Marty had to shoot much later and splice it into the story so it could be marketed as a sex exploitation picture. So if we're getting technical here, if Marty never shot a softcore porno montage, we wouldn't have experienced the rest of his incredible career. And if that isn't history right there, I really don't know what is. This one's probably gonna rub some people the wrong way, so let me explain. One thing I do really like about The Aviator is that this feels like Scorsese reflecting on his own career. In a way, the innovation of Hell's Angels is similar to the route Scorsese went down when it came to his early work like Mean Streets, when he helped pioneer this entire indie filmmaking scene during the 70s. The first hour is definitely the standout for me because Hughes is just an interesting figure, and I think Scorsese and DiCaprio both do such an excellent job at exploring every complexity that came with this guy's life. And this was probably Leo's best performance up until this point in his career. Cate Blanchett is also incredible as Katharine Hepburn, and whenever these two are on screen together, I feel like the story is at its most engaging. But she's out of the picture before we even hit the halfway point of the runtime, and once that happens, I feel like the momentum just completely halts. The film just becomes a little too repetitive with a ton of quick meetings where somebody goes, "Hey Howard, we have an issue here," and then Leo is like, "No worries guys, here's more money money. And then John C. Reilly is like, hey Howard, that's a lot of money. We can't keep spending money. And then that sequence will play out like 8 more times. When that isn't happening, Howard will scrub his hands super hard or freak out about his food with his over-the-top OCD. And that's kind of all I get out of the rest of the movie. The courtroom drama section of the final act has its moments, but by the end, it feels like I sat through a 4-hour movie, which is not how a majority of Scorsese's longer movies feel to me. This film also takes the teal and orange look way too far for me, to the point where it's almost like he tried to troll the future travel filmmakers that abuse that look to death. There's a ton of scenes here where the color grade just hurts my eyes, man, if I don't look away for even a second. It's a good movie, and I won't argue that, but after 2 viewings, I really just have no desire to give this another rewatch anytime soon. If I had never rewatched all of these movies recently, Cape Fear would have originally been dead last on my list. The first time I watched it was pretty close to the time I saw the original for the first time as well, and the difference felt like night and day to me. The version from 1962 has a really dark nature to it that really got under my skin, and Robert Mitchum's original take on Max Cady is one of my all-time favorite performances. So going into Scorsese's, I was pretty excited, until about 15 minutes into the movie when I realized that this was going to be a much goofier version of the story. I really didn't like it, but after revisiting this one a couple years later and knowing exactly what I was getting into, I decided to go along for the ride and ended up having a pretty good time, at least until De Niro started making out with a 15-year-old. And that was nominated for Best Kiss at the MTV Movie Awards? I mean, who was the jury that year? Jeff and Ghislaine? The only thing wilder than that is Robert De Niro's performance in this. It's a really different take from Robert Mitchum's, but he just goes all in on the wackiness here, making him the standout of the film by a mile. There are so many different petty ways he comes up with taunting this family that it's hard to not laugh at some points, and I found that to be a bit more intentionally funny on this rewatch compared to me cringing at it the first time. My biggest problem with Cape Fear is one that is pretty similar to my complaint of Shutter Island, which is that this also feels like a film that Scorsese just didn't really care about making, which I guess is also implied to be the case since he only made this for Universal because they gave him the money for The Last Temptation of Christ. Because the first time I watched it, I was like, this kind of feels like a fucked up Steven Spielberg movie. And then what do you know, on this recent viewing, I actually realized that Amblin Entertainment was behind it. There are some basic themes that get explored, like the corruption that occurs in the justice system or how kissing kids is bad. But at the end of the day, I don't have much else to say about this thriller other than I just prefer the original. What do you want me to do? We are talking about Martin Scorsese here. The guy has made some incredible movies, but Shutter Island feels the most director-for-hire Scorsese movie out of the entire bunch for me, at least besides Boxcar Bertha, and I think there's a reason he recently came out and said he kind of regrets making it in the first place, because it really doesn't feel like a story Marty was dying to tell, which is crazy that even when this guy phones it in, he can make a movie that is adored by the general public. Me personally, I don't think it's bad by any means. In fact, I do like this movie quite a bit, and there are a handful of really great scenes in here, but it does feel like almost anybody else could have made this movie. I love me a good mystery, and I think the way Shutter Island builds up that story throughout is really well done at times, with multiple scenes that really paint the bigger picture of what's going on in a really creepy way, even if it's a bit by the books. But I think the way it reveals the truth by the end of the movie, it's just way too goofy for me, man. Like, this guy really took the time to put this board together to explain everything to us like he was making a YouTube video essay. I also think out of every Leonardo DiCaprio performance I have ever seen, this one just felt like the most basic role for him to tackle. He's one of my favorite actors, but he's definitely known for repeating the same kind of performance in a lot of his films, and this one is just the prime example of Leo playing Leo for me. I think Scorsese actually nails the few moments of horror whenever they show up here though. Like the scene of them progressing through Ward C will creep most people out, I think, and this old lady doing this, yeah, I still have that ingrained in my mind from those commercials back in 2010. There are a handful of fun mystery conversations like that one in the cave, but then some of the reveals toward the end just don't stick the landing as cleanly as I want them to. And any movie that plays this song automatically loses some points for me. And I know for a lot of people this really is a top 5 Martin Scorsese movie, and hey, all power to you, and I'm glad you love it. Because listen, at the end of the day, it still might be my favorite M. Night Shyamalan movie. like Gangs of New York is so interesting to talk about just because I don't think there's too much to actually dive into when it comes to talking about this movie. What you see here is pretty much what you get. A gangster movie set in New York during the Civil War period, and that's kind of it. It's the thing that definitely stands out the most because seeing the master of the mob movie tackle the same genre in a completely different era sounds like a home run on paper. And in some instances, I think it gets close to doing that. The production design is off the charts here, and it really is the main reason I put this one a little higher up compared to some of those other picks. This was my first time watching it since I was like 13. So on this viewing, I was really able to see how Scorsese comments on the pointlessness of war and the racism around immigration, and the way he tackles them is subtle and not subtle at the same time throughout different points of the story. But all of that definitely went over my head when I was back in my Call of Duty phase. The acting is solid for most of the cast as well, with Daniel Day-Lewis being the undeniable standout. Many consider him to be the best actor of our time, and this has always been one of my favorite performances from him. The film's best moments all involve Bill the Butcher somehow, which is also just such a badass name for a villain. And every time he gets aggressive, it's genuinely terrifying. Even if when he gets loud, he sounds like Larry David to me.
I'm gonna teach you to speak English with this fucking knife. I don't want her monitoring my bathroom habits, okay?
This was the first time Leo teamed up with Marty, and I have to be honest, it's probably one of his weakest performances to date. His character is supposed to be Irish, and I swear, half of the voiceover lines sound like he just forgot to put the accent on. There's some very bizarre music and editing choices in here as well, making this really feel like a 2002 movie at a lot of points. Martin Scorsese is a master of filmmaking, we all know that, but when it comes to action scenes, he's just not that guy. But I think he knows that, and even if it doesn't fully work, I'm glad he at least tried it out. I also think the pacing slows down more and more as the film continues on, making this feel like one of the longest Scorsese movies, which is funny because even though it is definitely long, it is far from his longest. All I know is when it comes to choosing a Martin Scorsese gangster flick to put on for a couple of hours, this one's never gonna be my first choice. Man, Casino is another good movie, so don't get too upset. There is somebody out here that has Shutter Island, The Aviator, and Casino in their top 3 Scorsese. And if that's you, I love that for you. I'm sorry we disagree. Casino is a fun, by-the-numbers Scorsese flick, and I think that is the reason it ranks so low for me. It just does absolutely nothing to stand out in any department from the rest of his gangster films, even though the story is filling us in on a side of the mafia that hasn't really been explored before. Sure, The Godfather did its own version of the casino crime in Las Vegas for a brief moment, but this is a full 3-hour epic in that setting. But at the same time, this just doesn't hit the way his other mob movies do. Like, De Niro is good, but he's pretty much better in every other role on this list. Pesci is good, but my man feels like he's being held at gunpoint whenever he has to read lines for a voiceover.
Like when he hired that Jonathan and David and their tigers away from the palace by building them a new stage and then giving them a silver Rolls Royce.
Sharon Stone is good, but her character is one-dimensional to the point where my eyes were rolling anytime she did pretty much anything. I know this is based on a true story, but I feel like there could have been at least more depth to these people. The writing is solid enough, but it feels like Marty just had to turn something in before a midnight deadline on a Sunday night for school. But to give this movie credit, it's 3 hours long, and it really only feels like 2 at most. And I know that is how most of his other movies play out, but it's super impressive to me that even when one of his films is far from incredible, it can still fly by like nothing. And come on, I think we all know a lot of that credit goes to Thelma Schoonmaker, who I'm just going to declare is probably the best editor in film history. And I'm just gonna get that out of the way now instead of bringing her up 24 other times in this video, because she almost always does a perfect job when it comes to cutting these films together. Also, there are a handful of really good moments in here. That sunglasses shot is iconic, Pesci's last scene is set up so perfectly, and De Niro intimidating the 2 cheaters is the highlight of the film for me. I also have some fond memories of being brought along to casinos as a kid, and I've always had a weird fascination with them, so I think the energy of Las Vegas that is captured here really is the only thing that helps this film stand out from the rest on this list. But it kind of just ends there for me, and honestly I just think Hard 8 is way better. I saw Hugo back in 2011 when I was 15 years old, and I really didn't like it. It sticks out like a sore thumb when you compare it to everything else in Marty's body of work, considering this is a kid's movie and the big push of the marketing was, hey, you need to see it in 3D. After a rewatch at almost 27 years old, I have such conflicted opinions about this movie. The first half is so bad that I literally apologized to my girlfriend for making her sit through it with me. It has such an ugly digital look to everything, and I think a lot of the acting from Asa Butterfield and Chloe Grace Moretz is horrendous, and it's filled with scenes that are either too dull or too goofy. So I wouldn't blame anybody for talking shit about the first hour of this movie at all. I wanted to turn it off a couple times, but we stuck it out, and we were rewarded for doing so because the story unveiled the real reason Marty would be willing to make a kids movie in the first place. It's the redemption arc for the filmmaker Georges Méliès, a guy who, even if you asked me who's that before watching this movie, I probably wouldn't know the answer off the top of my head, even though he made arguably the first iconic film ever made in A Trip to the Moon, which I have seen and enjoyed before. I'm really trying my best to study film history, guys, okay? I swear. His story, though, is a hard one to hear, considering he was such an early pioneer for the medium before he was exiled out of the industry, with hundreds of his films being lost forever. But this sort of fairy tale take on his later life is the entire heart of Hugo, which is funny since every scene that is just about Hugo just kind of stinks. The scene where his wife gets to see her younger self on the film reel had me bawling out of nowhere, and I think those 5 minutes perfectly portray the reason so many of us love watching and making movies. With how much work Scorsese has put into the restoration of over hundreds of films, it feels like a passionate reflection of what he has contributed to the history of cinema, and to this day, it's the only Martin Scorsese film that has made me cry. I think whenever the story focuses exclusively on this concept, it's great. It's a complete 180 from what I felt in that first half. But if you're not interested in the art of filmmaking or film history, I just don't know how much you would get out of this, especially for a kid's movie, because I just can't see many children coming out of this and saying, "Oh my gosh, mom and dad, Hugo was my favorite movie ever. I can't wait to go back and watch that 5 more times." That's just not happening. It is sweet in moments and barely won me over in the end, but if I wasn't a nerd with a YouTube channel about movies, this would be close to last place for sure. I have such a weird relationship with Mean Streets because on my most recent rewatch, I didn't like it as much as I had on my first viewing. There were just a lot of parts that really felt dragged out to me, and the overall impact of the story just didn't stick in my head that long after the credits rolled. There is a reason this guy is regarded as the best when it comes to gangster movies, and that is because no matter what time period it is, whether it's an old New York in Gangs of New York, a modern Boston in The Departed, or the home of the Osage 100 years ago in Killers of the Flower Moon, Scorsese perfectly embodies whatever setting he is setting out to portray. The thing that makes Mean Streets stand out from the rest of his mob movies is the way that he isn't recreating a time period here, but rather capturing one in real time. I mean, yeah, he did the same thing in Who's That Knocking at My Door, but there is just so much more energy in the way he captures New York in this film compared to his debut. So much so that most people still believe to this day that Mean Streets is his first movie. It's a vibe that is so specific to Mean Streets that I don't really think Marty ever captured that same gritty guerrilla filmmaking feeling in any of his other future work. And I think the authenticity to both the environment and Marty's upbringing is why it works as well as it does. Harvey Keitel is great in this, but it's clear why Marty stopped making him his protagonist after the breakout performance from De Niro, which is still one of my favorites from him to this day. Obviously later on he was able to dial his acting abilities in a lot better, but he is absolutely electric as Johnny Boy here. Marty must have gotten home from his first day working on set together with him and wrote a note to himself, "Hey, this De Niro guy, he's pretty good. We should work together again sometime." The dialogue in every way is a massive improvement compared to his first 2 movies, and this was the first of many soundtracks he was just able to nail perfectly. The story definitely drags in the second half for me, making this another one that feels a lot longer than it actually is, and I do think it is 3 or 4 iconic scenes away from getting the title of Scorsese classic in my eyes, even if the rest of the world already believes that it definitely is one. At the end of the day though, I just don't think this one is as rewatchable as some of the other gangster flicks on the list, but it's a pretty good one if you haven't seen it yet. Nobody talks about New York, New York, and the people that do tend to rank it pretty low on their list. But I've seen it twice now, and I think it is without a doubt Scorsese's most underrated movie, which is crazy considering the famous Sinatra song that I guess isn't a Frank Sinatra song actually came from this movie. It's a musical, well, I guess it's kind of a musical. It follows this couple played by Liza Minnelli and Robert De Niro as they play music, fall in love, and then the relationship gets a little bit rocky, which is definitely a super original idea that we have never seen in any other movie before, I know. But I do think Scorsese makes it work here. De Niro is great as always, but Liza Minnelli gives one of my favorite performances from the 26 movies we are talking about here. And no matter what kind of scene they are diving into together, whether it be romantic, musical, combative, or any combination of the three really, their chemistry is some of the best I have ever seen put to screen. It has the romance from Age of Innocence, but it also has that manipulation from Raging Bull. It has these old school Hollywood sets that are supposed to give you that magical feeling of some of the classics, which really gives an unsettling contrast to how the story starts to develop. It just feels like a fucked up reality that tries to paint itself up as a fairy tale, and I think it really works in that regard. I know he always mentions The Umbrellas of Cherbourg as his main inspiration, but I wouldn't be surprised if Damien Chazelle got a lot of ideas from this while working on La La Land, because there are a ton of similarities when comparing the two side by side. It's also one of the funniest movies on this entire list, and has a scene that is the most New York interaction ever put to screen, besides the obvious Midnight Cowboy one. In terms of long Scorsese movies that actually feel long, this is definitely one of them. My first viewing didn't really fly by per se, but my rewatch definitely had me checking the time quite a few times. Even though I find it more engaging than most people and highly recommend you check it out, I'm not gonna lie to you, La La Land is still the better movie. Okay, here we go. I want to love The Irishman. I really want to love The Irishman. But after two disappointing viewings 4 years apart, I'm just not there right now. It's a film I love on paper more than the actual execution on screen, because as a send-off for Scorsese and his crew, it should be a top 5 in his filmography for me. And I think it almost gets there in the final hour, which is just so enthralling from the second it gets rolling to the very last. All of these long scenes have built to this climax that occurs 2 hours and 45 minutes into the movie. But those last 45 minutes really is some of the best storytelling I have seen in the past 5 years. But God, the first 2 hours and 45 minutes are just so frustrating for me. I know a lot of people have defended this movie's runtime, but I think it is way, and I mean way too long. It just feels like at least 45 minutes can be shaved off of each individual scene if they just ended it a little bit earlier than they choose to. And maybe if I found the plot of this one to be as interesting as a lot of these other movies, then maybe I wouldn't care too much about the length. But for me, everything before Frank's celebration is just so damn bland. 2.5 hours of what feels like Scorsese just phoning it in on cruise control mode. So many of these conversations just feel like variations of other scenes that Scorsese has already done dozens of times by this point. Like the scene where the Italian guy is just like, hey, why is the seat wet? And Jesse Plemons is like, I had a fish for a friend back there. And then the Italian guy's like, what kind of fish did you get? It just feels like a scene a freshman in film school would write. The digital de-aging also hurts the immersion almost every time it shows up on screen. And I really think it will hurt this film in the long run when it comes to picking timeless classics from this guy's catalog. Pesci still looks old as hell, and De Niro's moving like a grandpa in almost all of these scenes. By far the worst example of this is when he goes to the store to beat up the clerk, and for some reason they decide to shoot this whole scene in a single wide shot. Like, why did nobody suggest to switch the angle here? Because this, look at this is terrible. The film has a hyper digital look that every other Netflix movie tends to have, and it is one of the ugliest looking movies I have seen in the past couple years because of it. Granted, I really don't watch any of the other Netflix originals these days, and I'm sure they look uglier, but most of the set designs just feel so uninspired. Everybody praises the main 3 performances, but I think all of them are kind of just fine at best. I liked how Pesci played a very different kind of character than what he normally does for Marty, but the guy just feels tired and seems like he doesn't really want to be there. Al Pacino feels like he's a bit more into it, but the performance is just a little too goofy for me in certain scenes. And I think the film tends to feel slowest whenever he's part of it. Even though I don't find it to be one of De Niro's best performances, he does do a pretty good job at portraying the devastation and guilt that Frank goes through in the later years of his life, dealing with the consequences of his actions in a way that only an older Martin Scorsese could explore. And when it comes to Marty's perspective here, it does feel like he is facing death head on, looking back on the legacy he will leave behind in a genre that he is undeniably the king of. And I think that soul aspect of the film is strong enough for me to put this one up as high as I could. Maybe it will get into my top 5 Scorsese one day, but at this moment, I am pretty doubtful. You never really know what you're gonna get when Marty and Paul Schrader team up, and Bringing Out the Dead is both familiar and completely different compared to their other collaborations. It has obvious hints to being a spiritual successor to Taxi Driver, but it's also a lot funnier than something like Taxi Driver. Plus, it's filled with moments that make you question, is life worth living? Kind of like Taxi Driver. Nick Cage plays a sleep-deprived, haunted paramedic that just doesn't want to clock into a pointless shift, wasting his life away. So I find the guy pretty relatable. We follow him during 3 back-to-back night shifts from hell, and I don't think anybody could predict the variety of insane people this guy encounters in that short amount of time. It's like the people I used to work with at McDonald's back in high school. There is such a pessimistic nature to this movie that only Paul Schrader can make as funny as it is. Even if I didn't find the ideas in here nearly as compelling as most of his other written work, I also think Nick Cage is perfect for the character they were going for here. Does he go full Nick Cage at points?
You have the nerve to sit here wanting to die and not go through with it? You make me sick! Take it!
And I wouldn't have it any other way. There are just so many different types of street scum that this guy encounters while working, and the way they portray these paramedics dealing with each situation consistently finds a way to be both surprising and hilarious. Like the running joke of the old drunk Mr. O is just one example of the many crazy side characters that crack me up on every single viewing. And the story is filled with so many little subplots like that. I was a little upset that John Goodman disappears a little too early into the story, but as soon as Ving Rhames showed up, I was like, okay, I don't need John Goodman, I guess, because this is one of the most underrated performances on this list, because I think he absolutely obliterates every scene he is in. The only real knock I have against the movie is that it kind of just comes and goes whenever I see it. Like, I enjoy watching it, but like I mentioned with Schrader's writing, it just doesn't end up being as deep as I think it wants it to be. I also think the third act starts to lose a good amount of steam as soon as it starts, mainly because Tom Sizemore's character is just nowhere near as entertaining as Nick Cage's first 2 partners, but that is also when Nick Cage gets the craziest, so it's not that bad. I watched this around the start of the Halloween season for both viewings accidentally, and even though I have no reason to back this claim up, I do think this is a good pick for October when it's Halloween season. It's not a horror movie by any means, but there is something about those cold, early fall nights that is perfect for the mood of this one. It's definitely a fun watch if you haven't seen it yet, but for me, it just fits perfectly in the middle tier of Scorsese. This is another one that ranks pretty low on most people's lists, and to be fair, it did on mine for a while too. And maybe it's just because every like 9 months, my friends and I have the urge to get really good at pool, and right now I'm in that mood to play pool in a place that smells like cigarettes at least twice a week, but I also think this is a really good pool movie. In fact, the only competition for it being the best pool movie is the movie it's a sequel to. There's a lot of people that go into this without watching The Hustler, which I think is kind of a blasphemous thing to do, not only because The Hustler is good and definitely worth watching, but also because it is essential to get the full impact of Paul Newman's brilliant performance. In a lot of ways, this feels like the original Top Gun Maverick, and maybe it feels like that because we are watching Tom Cruise go full-on goofy bro mode in this movie as Vince, but it's a second chapter that explores similar themes of legends testing if they still have their touch years later, while also diving into the apocalyptic days of your passion, when you realize the good old days will never be experienced again by not only you, but the future generation as well. In that way, I think there is a much sadder undertone to The Color of Money compared to Top Gun 2, and it works as well as it does because Paul Newman is just so damn good in this role. It's a bit of a quieter one, but you can tell he just fully embodies Fast Eddie, even 25 years later when he has to deal with not being the hustler he once was. I know some people question it, but I think he definitely deserved his Academy Award for this, and it's wild that it was the only time he ever won. Even though it's not one of Tom Cruise's best performances, you can tell he is having a ton of fun in this role. Like, the guy's wearing a shirt with his name on it, doing martial arts with a Q. I mean, come on, how could you not have fun with this? In a lot of ways, this perfectly captured the passing of the baton from Newman to Cruise, and I think they have plenty of great scenes together, with at least one of them that is guaranteed to break your heart a little bit. Also, you can't talk about this movie without talking about the shot composition for the games, because the cinematography here is just so damn satisfying to watch. It is unbelievable. I might just stitch together all the pool sequences and make it my screensaver for my computer, because it's that mesmerizing to look at. I honestly don't have that many knocks against the movie because we are slowly entering great film territory on this list. It definitely fits in the your dad's favorite sports movie genre, and in that regard, I do think it's one of the best. But if that kind of movie is not usually up your alley, this one is probably going to rank pretty low for you. And although I objectively think it's not one of Scorsese's best movies, I can see myself ranking it even higher the older I get, because after only 2 viewings, it feels like a favorite comfort film. Just like how Oppenheimer ranked in the middle of my Nolan video, Scorsese's newest release falls in a pretty similar spot on the list. And again, this is because I am really cautious when it comes to recency bias. And a lot of the times I need to really let a film sit with me for a couple of weeks or even months to feel its full impact, or lack thereof in some cases. I did read David Grant's book in preparation for the movie, and I think going in with that knowledge makes this viewing so much more interesting to talk about. When I was reading the story play out, I couldn't stop reading for about the first 100 pages, trying to figure out who exactly was behind all of these murders. You figured it was a white guy, but you didn't know which white guy. The book tells the story more like a mystery, because I couldn't believe it when I found out that William Hale was behind the whole thing. And as Martin Scorsese has said, this tragic story is not really about who did it, but rather who didn't do it, with the amount of leeches who were in on this thing. There is a lot of discussion around Martin Scorsese not making the film have a more Osage point of view, and I have pretty mixed feelings on that critique, because my main review of the book has always been, well, it starts off great, but then it loses steam once the focus shifts from Molly to Tom White, who, if you don't know, is the FBI agent played by Jesse Plemons in the film. And Tom White himself is an interesting character in both history and this story, but I just wasn't nearly as engaged with that part of it as I was with the tragedy revolving around Molly. After that, it focuses on Ernest and Hale during the trial, and then it ends with the author going to Oklahoma and discussing his interactions with the modern day Osage. The original idea was to cast Leo as Tom White instead of Ernest, which would have been the more typical approach for Scorsese to take, but instead they agreed that the heart of the film revolved around the relationship between Molly and Ernest, along with letting the audience know from the beginning who the bad guys are here, and giving them a majority of the screen time. This is a movie about a tragedy, and with that will always come comments about what the movie should have been versus just talking about what the movie actually did. It's just like how there isn't one type of Holocaust film. From the little I know about the upcoming Zone of Interest, I think it follows a Nazi family that lives in a dream home right next to Auschwitz. One of the most underrated films I've ever seen is Conspiracy, which tells the story of how the Holocaust was planned in a fucking conference room. These stories aren't void of any empathy to the Jewish people. In fact, it's the exact opposite, making you furious at how cruel humanity can be. And at the end of the day, there are a ton of films out there that depict the tragedy of the Holocaust, and Killers of the Flower Moon is the only major on-screen portrayal of the Osage murders. This is not me trying to compare one genocide to another by any means, but rather to point out that I think the argument of this movie being too dangerous or too distasteful for giving the real-life villains of this story the most screen time is just not a great argument. I too would love if Molly was the main character here, not only because she is at the center of these murders, but also because Lily Gladstone gives the best performance of the year here. But just like the book and real life, Molly was forced to be bedridden for a majority of a specific timeline of these events. If there were 5 more scenes of her sitting around in a bed talking to Ernest, do you know how many people would be complaining, "No wonder this movie is so long, we get so many scenes of Molly being tired in bed"? Part of making a great film is going where the story should go, rather than trying to force it to go in a direction that you want it to go. Choosing to tell this story from this perspective doesn't make Scorsese a racist or anything, because he is creating a story that shows how evil humanity can be if we let the wrong people get too much power. And I think a lot of people trying to get clicks online for saying so either haven't seen the movie yet or didn't understand the ending at all, which is one of the most self-aware endings of all time, probably. Like, he knows exactly what he is doing with the story and the ingrained problem with telling the story of the Osage murders in this fashion. But without an iconic director like him, who knows how long it would have taken to get this story told on screen, if ever. I think Marty portrays the Osage beautifully here, but with a film this monumental, we will hopefully open the doors for other on-screen portrayals of this time in history, especially with some very different perspectives that we really want to see. And now I'm done ranting, so let's talk about the actual movie, okay? I think it's very, very good. I'm really close to saying great, I really am, and I think I will get there on a rewatch, but right now it's just out of my top 10 when it comes to talking about this filmography. Like I already said, I think Lily Gladstone is the standout of this whole thing. She is flat out incredible in every scene she is in, and I can't wait to see where her career goes from here. I also think De Niro was pretty amazing here, because 30 minutes in, all you want to do is trip this old man to take him out. And even though he is way older than what William Hale was at this time, thank God they didn't choose to de-age him in this one. Leo was very good, but I thought he was the weakest of the three. I do appreciate how there was only like one typical Leo breakdown scene here, and he fully embodied being a dumbass for sure, but I still think he has at least 5 performances that are better than this one. Is the movie too long? I guess it depends on who you ask, but for me, this feels like a 3-hour and 10-minute movie, whereas The Irishman felt like 4 hours, even though The Irishman is actually 3 minutes longer. If I were to have changed the structure of the story at all, I think I would have made the first 20 minutes of the film focus on that first chapter of the book, where Molly finds out her sister Anna has been murdered, which happens around the 1-hour mark of this movie. It is just such a cold opening in the book and sets everything up perfectly, and I feel like there could have been a way to still open on that entire sequence. And even though it is a beautiful movie, I don't think the $200 million budget was used to its fullest potential, with some of the occasional CGI just really taking me out of the whole thing with these beautiful vista shots. And also, giving Brendan Fraser $5 million for those jarring 5 minutes is just burning money away. Good for you, Brendan, you robbed them blind. This is the only film on the list I have only seen once so far, but I will definitely be trying to give it a rewatch before the end of the year to see if it stays in my top 10 of 2023. Another one that most people have on their Scorsese watch list, which is a shame since it definitely earns its spot in my top 10. It's about a woman who recently became a widow, just trying to survive day-to-day life as a single mother, and that's really it. Just from that description and the footage you are looking at right now, you would be right in thinking that this is not what comes to mind when you try to describe the typical Martin Scorsese movie. It was only his 4th picture, and along with Boxcar Bertha and New York, New York, this is really only one of 3 movies that has a woman in the lead role, something he has been criticized for his entire career up to this point. But from now on, whenever I see somebody try to make that point, I'm just gonna send them this clip.
I was shooting The Exorcist, and as the dailies were going into the rushes were being viewed by Warner Brothers, I got a message from them that they'd like to do another film with me. All of the scripts on their shelves were, the female characters were either housewives who were supporting their husband, the hero, who was going out and saving the world, or they were whores, or they were bitches. And I was just awakening to the women's movement myself. And so I said to them, I would really like to do a film about a woman as I understand women to be right now. And so I went looking for the script, and I found it. Bob Getchell's script. Alice doesn't live here anymore. And who do you want to direct it? And they suggested several people. I said, no, I'd like a new director, somebody who's at the beginning of their career. And they said, who? And I said, I don't know, I'll have to find him. So I called Francis Coppola. I said, who do you know that's a director? I need a director who's new and exciting. He said, why don't you look at a film called Mean Streets? And of course I was very impressed. I mean, it was the first time I saw Bobby De Niro and Harvey Keitel and Marty's incredible camera work and texture and the quality of the acting, everything about it I loved. I asked for a meeting with Marty, and we sat in John Kelly's office, and in walked this nervous little Italian guy who perched on the edge of his chair. I said, I really liked your film very much. I love the level of reality. It's the level of reality I want in this film, but this film is about a woman. And there was only one female role in your picture, and I couldn't tell from that if you know anything about women, do you? And he said, no, but I'd like to learn. And I thought that was a really incredible answer.
The first rule almost any director, screenwriter, or any artist will tell you is to capture what you know. Like I mentioned for Mean Streets, one of the things that cements Scorsese as one of the best to ever do it is his ability to fully encapsulate himself in the culture of whatever film he does. There's a reason he had such a large team of Osage collaborating with him on Killers of the Flower Moon, making sure that everything he was capturing was as historically accurate as it possibly could be, making sure the traditions within that community were being portrayed in a way to not only expose them to a new audience, but celebrate them as well. Just like Marty, I know nothing about women. Just ask my girlfriend, she'll tell you. And if you were to ask the average person who would have directed this, they would probably say, I don't know, but it's definitely not Martin Scorsese. But a character study, or honestly a good movie of any kind, should be able to seamlessly suck you into its world, emotionally connecting you to its characters in a way that makes it feel like you are stepping into their shoes just for a small portion of their day. And Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore pulls that off perfectly. Ellen Burstyn has always been a favorite actor of mine because no matter how big or small her role is, she always steals the show. I mean, the woman is in like 2 minutes of Interstellar and makes it the best scene of the entire movie. But out of her entire body of work, this might be my favorite performance. When she is supposed to be funny, she is hilarious. When she is supposed to be sad, she's gonna break your heart. When she is supposed to be scared, she makes you feel like we are in a thriller, even though it's a really terrifying reality. It's one of Marty's most emotional films, and she carries it on her back. Just like Paul Newman for The Color of Money, she absolutely deserved her first and only Academy Award for this. The life she brings to Alice also makes this surprisingly one of the funniest movies on this entire list.
Would you mind turn around for me?
Turn around for you? Why?
I want to look at you.
Well, look at my face. I don't sing with my ass.
A lot of the best moments are between her and the son Tommy, who isn't played all that great by Alfred Lutter, but I also think the bad acting kind of adds to the frustrating, annoying nature that he is supposed to have anyway. Harvey Keitel is pretty good in the few scenes that he has as well, and Chris Christopherson nails his role perfectly too. I do think the final act of the film loses a bit of steam as it goes on, because there are some aspects that get a little too repetitive for me, especially when it's getting close to the end of that 2-hour runtime. But if you haven't seen this one yet, I hope I sold you on checking it out, because it's a very different film from him and it's well worth it. Okay, I can explain why it ranks this low. It's a great movie, okay? What do you want me to do? This guy specializes in making bangers. I used to think this was one of the most overrated movies ever made when I was like 15 and had no idea what I was talking about, but don't worry, I've come around to this one over the years. The Departed is a remake of the Hong Kong thriller Infernal Affairs, which I recently watched for the first time and also really enjoyed. But I think that one has some cheesy 2002 editing that doesn't really hold up as well these days. And for that reason, I think The Departed is one of the few films that is actually better than the original. It's hard to give too much credit to the story here, since Infernal Affairs really did all of the heavy lifting when it came to creating this exciting concept in the first place. The concept of having one mole infiltrate a police department for a mob boss and an undercover cop infiltrating that same boss's crew is a great premise for any movie. And both Leo and Matt Damon give some of the best performances of their career. But the real standout for me, and it isn't even close, is Jack Nicholson. He's one of the best to ever do it, but this is also one of my favorite performances from him. The dude is just he's fucking crazy here. His presence is a force that can be felt every single time he shows up on screen. It's like whenever Heath Ledger shows up in The Dark Knight and all of a sudden you go, oh shit. Scorsese has gotten so many great performances out of so many of the greatest actors ever, but this might be my favorite from the entire list. And even though I loved Alan Arkin in Little Miss Sunshine, I think Nicholson deserved the Oscar 10 times more here. It's also crazy that this is the only film that got Scorsese his own Academy Award. And even though I like 8 more movies in this catalog, I also think this is in contention for being his most well-directed movie. The way he is able to block so many of these scenes keeps you on the edge of your seat the whole time. And as soon as he gets you comfortable, he turns the tables on your expectations. I also can't think of a film that does the undercover cop storyline better than this movie. But seriously, maybe the credit goes to Leo for being one of the best actors of all time, or the tension of Nicholson being in the same room, but there is so much great suspense and moments where these two are just talking. The stakes are set so high from the moment that cast breaks, and the story just achieves a level of fear that I don't think any of his other gangster movies quite reach. The only reason I don't have it higher is for the simple fact that I don't have the urge to rewatch this one as frequently as some of the other picks on this list. I've been on Letterboxd since 2015 and I couldn't believe I hadn't rewatched this at least once since then, especially when everything ranked higher has been logged at least twice by me. I think it's a great time every time I see it, but it doesn't turn my brain on the way some of the other Scorsese movies do. And that's the kind of experience I just usually tend to lean towards. If you ask me, hey, you want to watch a Martin Scorsese movie? I'm just not gonna pitch The Departed. But if you approach me and say, hey, you want to watch The Departed? I will say yes without even hesitating. Does that even make sense? I don't know if it does. I just had to justify why this pick is low, and let's just move on. After Hours is just so good, man. If you haven't seen it yet, I would say you should definitely skip to the next timestamp of the video, because I think going into this one knowing as little as possible will enhance your experience so much more than any other movie on this list. That's how I did it, and I couldn't be happier with that decision, because this movie is crazy It's crazy. And it just gets crazier every single scene. I'm a pretty big fan of Curb Your Enthusiasm, clearly, since this is my second reference to it in this video, but this just feels like the most exaggerated, over-the-top Curb Your Enthusiasm episode ever made. Even though I think very few people have had a night out exactly like this, I would say a lot of us have had at least one day where it feels like absolutely nothing is going our way, and every time you are about to catch a break, something even crazier happens. And this movie just dials that idea up to 11. I know Griffin Dunne is not as big of a name as De Niro or DiCaprio or Keitel, but this guy deserved so much more work than he has gotten in his career. Scorsese prioritizes choosing the best actor for his characters, which I think is a good thing, but that being said, I wish he still could have found a way to incorporate Griffin in some smaller roles. The guy is so good in this movie as Paul, with perfect comedic timing in both his dialogue and facial expressions. I've already mentioned a couple of his other films being pretty funny, but this is his only straight up comedy. It's a weird comedy, but so many of these scenes crack me up every single time. Trying to hop over the turnstile, getting chased by an evil Mr. Softy truck, and being kidnapped after turning into a statue. I have yet to hear anybody say they didn't have a fun time watching this. If adult sleepovers were a thing, I feel like this would be the perfect movie to throw on with a bunch of drunk friends. Scorsese is the king of New York filmmaking, but the way he captures his city in this movie feels so unique compared to the rest of his work. It has hints of Taxi Driver for sure, but just keeping the story in an unfamiliar neighborhood to both the character and the audience really adds to the anxiety levels of being stranded in a part of New York that you probably don't want to get stuck in around this time of night. The energy of this thing just feels like the blueprint for what the Safdie brothers have been trying to capitalize on so far in their career. And I'm a little surprised Scorsese never tried making something like this again. The most common complaint of most of this guy's movies is the fact that they're too long, but I think you could make a case where the only flaw in After Hours is the fact that it's too short. Sure, some people might think it's the perfect length, and honestly, when you were in the middle of binging a bunch of 3-hour crime dramas, it is nice to get the fun 97-minute movie sprinkled in there. But the world that is painted here is so fun to experience that I think there could have been 2 or 3 more bits added to the mix. Out of every movie on this list, I am most tempted to move After Hours up a few more spots, and I think that alone speaks to how much I love this movie. I know I've been spoiling bits and pieces for some of these movies throughout this video, and I already just gave you a spoiler warning for After Hours, but again, if you know nothing about The Last Temptation of Christ, skip to the next timestamp and go into this one blind. And you might be wondering, what could possibly be spoiled for a Jesus movie, Chase? And hopefully, if that alone gets you interested in checking that one out, I am happy I sold you on it, because that is how I went into my first watch back in 2019, and man, was I surprised at what I witnessed. Because this movie is fucking nuts. Like most people in the world, religion is something I have a pretty complicated relationship with. And although I don't actively go to church or anything like that, I did grow up going to Catholic school, so I'm pretty familiar with the usual Jesus story. I've probably seen a dozen of forgettable movies about this guy throughout my lifetime, and maybe I shouldn't be surprised that Martin Scorsese has made the best version of what this kind of movie can be, but it is, without a doubt, the most controversial movie on the entire list. There were tons of protests across the world when it was released back in 1988, even inciting a terrorist attack at a Paris movie theater when a group decided to set a theater on fire while people were watching it. Scorsese received so many death threats that he needed bodyguards around him for quite a few years. None of that sounds like being a good Christian to me, but what do I know? I'm just the movie guy. I'm not here to talk about anything else. So why do I rank it so high on a list that has films like The Departed, Killers of the Flower Moon, and The Irishman under it? For those that have seen it, you know this story isn't directly adapted from the New Testament, but rather a novel of the same name by Nikos, I'm not going to pronounce that last name. It doesn't look at Jesus from the godlike perfect perspective that some of these other movies try to portray him as, but rather it looks at the real human side of the story, where he is questioning everything about his life's purpose and the struggles that come with being the savior of humanity. When Jesus tells his parables, some people make fun of him for how dumb they sound. When he goes off on the merchants in the temple, he looks like an angry, crazy person, because that's what it probably looked like to some degree when it happened in real life. And then you have the final act, which is just, I mean, it is one of the best of all time for me. Out of nowhere, it just turns into one of the scariest movies I have ever seen. And I think it's because you're just so caught off guard from feeling that kind of fear in a religious film like this. The first time I watched this was at like 4 o'clock in the morning, and I almost shit my pants. If Ari Aster ever announced he wanted to make a Jesus movie, I'd be pretty interested to see what he would do with it and how that one would go with the Christian community. But this already feels like the best version of what he would want to do with that story. And it's all contained within that final sequence of the film. Seeing what Jesus' life would look like if he did give in to his temptations by falling in love with Mary Magdalene and starting a family while also letting the rest of the world down as a result of that is an absolutely insane subplot to put in a Christian movie. I mean, having a sex scene with Jesus, I can see why that looks pretty bad on paper. But I think harsh critics of these scenes don't talk about the bigger picture of this film or their own religion, because isn't the whole point of why people look up to Jesus Christ in the first place is because he gave up everything he could have in life to save humanity? Whether you believe in that or not, I think that's a pretty admirable thing for somebody to do. And I think Scorsese does an excellent job at portraying what the heaviness of that burden would do on somebody emotionally, physically, and spiritually. The film relies heavily on Willem Dafoe's performance, which I still can't believe we live in a world where Willem Dafoe plays Jesus, but somehow we do, and I love it. But he is so good here. I really believe in my heart that this is his best performance ever. With the way he is able to turn the dial from 1 to 10 back to 1 from scene to scene is just so impressive. I think the reason Harvey Keitel gets so much hate for playing Judas is simply because Dafoe outshines him in every single scene. And to be honest, nobody in the cast even comes close to his level here. You could argue this is Scorsese's biggest passion project, and I think the details in the production just help the argument. Although they were rushed to finish this thing in less than 2 months, the entire crew makes Morocco feel like you are actually in Judea, to the point where they could have made it look like a damn documentary if they really wanted to. It's just one of those movies that I could talk about endlessly. Even though it's probably not as rewatchable as some of the other films on this list for me, I need to be in a very specific mood to watch something like this, and there are definitely a few scenes that feel a bit more dragged out than they should be, but overall, this is another good gangster movie from Martin Scorsese. Again, this guy is just, he's one of the best directors of all time. A lot of people consider this to be his masterpiece, along with being the best film of the 80s in general. So you might be wondering why I have another movie from the 80s directed by Martin Scorsese ranked even higher than Raging Bull, which is crazy. I have to defend ranking one of my all-time favorite movies since it doesn't even make the top 5, but here we go. I've seen Raging Bull at least 6 times now, and I think it's one you definitely respect more as you get older. It's so funny because I used to say, man, this is the best sports movie of all time, and a lot of people do that still, but the more you watch it, the more you realize the focus of Raging Bull isn't really about boxing at all. This is a character study of a guy that is so out of touch, so abusive without any thought to the people around him, that he can't ever take control of his life without ruining every single thing around him. Scorsese didn't even want to make this movie at first because he admittedly knew jack shit about sports and thought there was nothing unique that he could add to the genre. After a cocaine overdose almost killed him though, Marty, New York was not that bad, okay? I promise. But he spiraled so out of control that he thought about making a boxing movie with fights that felt almost dreamlike, where the ring served as a punishment for our sins in the real world. De Niro is so good at playing a scumbag, and even though most people agree that this is one of his best performances, I still think people don't give him enough credit for what he did. The dude became an actual boxer to prepare for the film, and he won 2 out of 3 real fights. Even the actual Jake LaMotta claimed he was in the top 20 best middleweight fighters in the history of the sport. The physicality he brings to the role is unmatched, and you feel terrified for any other character that is left alone in a room with him. The rise and fall of a star has been done hundreds of times throughout the history of cinema, and Scorsese himself has even tackled it quite a few times now. But you could argue he's the best to ever tell this kind of story, because the way he and De Niro are able to make such an unlikable human transform into someone so engaging to watch in every single scene is not something that just any team can pull off, but these two legends always find a way. That scene of him punching the wall after being arrested is still one of the best moments I have ever seen any actor pull off, and it also helps that he has one of the best supporting casts ever surrounding him. Enough people smarter than me have talked about how brilliantly composed the boxing scenes are, so all I will add to that conversation is, man, they're really good, aren't they? The black and white film complements the entire vibe of the story, and it really helps it feel like a distinct entry in this entire body of work. I know it's Scorsese collaborating with De Niro and Pesci again, but this is so distinct from anything else this guy has ever made. This guy can only make a gangster movie, right? It's not a fun movie to sit through, and I think some people miss the entire point of why this is one of the best character studies of all time, and I think anybody that says, dude, Raging Bull is awesome, should probably get an FBI background check. And my only negative of the film is that I just think 5 more Scorsese movies are a little bit better. I'm a big believer that everything, especially film, deserves a second chance. Silence was my most anticipated movie of 2016 because I have always been a fan of Martin Scorsese, and I knew he had been fighting for years to get this passion project made. So I went to a 9 p.m. screening, and within 45 minutes, it had put me to sleep a little bit. I still caught pretty much the entire movie, but it is tough for me to fall asleep in a movie theater. I was just so bored by everything happening within the story, with the pacing that felt slower than a snail and a voiceover from Jesus Christ himself, that I just walked away extremely disappointed by what I watched. Experience completely changes your perception on certain films later in life, and although I'm no scholar at almost 27 now, this hit me so much more now than it did when I was 20. What bored me 7 years ago had me glued to the screen this time around. And maybe that's because my relationship with faith has consistently changed throughout those 7 years, but this movie just hit me on such an unexpected emotional level. Whether you are a believer in something or not, I think that is one of the things that makes this film work as well as it does. Every single character in this story, no matter how major or minor of a role they play, contributes something to that overall question of, is believing in something really worth it? And even if you are biased in your answer when you come into this film, I think the story does a great job at making points for why the other side would make the choices that they end up making here. I know Scorsese has captured some of the best performances of all time, but if we were rating these films on the performance of the entire ensemble, I think you could make the case that this is Scorsese's best. Every Japanese actor is incredible in this, and the three A-listers do some of their best work here. Adam Driver is always good, and honestly, he might be the best actor working today. I mean, I saw that movie 65 where he's a space marine that takes on dinosaurs, and obviously the movie was pretty bad, but Adam Driver was still great somehow. So even though his 65 performance solidified him as maybe the best actor in the business for me, I think he is obviously more incredible in this. He doesn't get as much time to shine as Andrew Garfield does, but he serves as a great counterpart in this priesthood duo. Liam Neeson gives maybe the best performance of his entire career, and he's in the movie for like 2 scenes, but he absolutely annihilates every second he's on screen, with one of those scenes being the absolute best of the film for me. But the entire story really lies on Andrew Garfield's shoulders, who I always consider to be a pretty great actor, but his performance is on a whole other level here. He's like Zoe Saldana, where whenever they cry, you really think their closest loved one died right in front of them in real life right there, and somebody just happened to be there recording it. And even the moments where his performance requires silence, he does an excellent job portraying whatever emotion he wants through his facial expressions. He absolutely deserved to win an Oscar for this back in 2017, even though he wasn't even nominated for his best performance of the year. Visually, this is without a doubt the strongest film in his entire body of work. The on-set locations in Taiwan are absolutely breathtaking to look at, and the contrast of these vistas with the violence that is scattered throughout the story makes this the most comfortable, uncomfortable movie I've probably ever sat through. In terms of pacing, I still think about 20 minutes could have been shaved off about halfway into the story. Every moment before Garfield is captured is intense and engaging, and even after he is captured, that statement remains mostly true. But there are a couple of scenes within that part of the story that either feel a little too stretched out or just flat out repetitive for me. But that is a small nitpick in a film that I am tempted to call a masterpiece. If you didn't like a movie that everybody else loved before, I'd say give it a couple years and come back to it. You might end up having the same opinion you did on a first watch, but there's a chance of you discovering a new favorite film that you were convinced wasn't for you a couple years ago. Because that is exactly what happened to me here, and this is the best film I have ever seen when it comes to faith. Let's switch gears to one that most people love, but the general public often doesn't bring up when you mention Martin Scorsese. The king of comedy is brilliant in almost every single department. It has that uncomfortable humor from After Hours, but features some of that uncomfortable dreamlike nature from Taxi Driver. Add arguably Robert De Niro's best performance in the mix, and you have one of my favorite movies of all time. It's hard to pick a favorite when it comes to De Niro's work, and you could credit a lot of this to the writing of the Rupert Pupkin character, but this is an all-time legendary performance. I'd have to sit down and really think about an all-time favorite movie characters list, but I think there's a chance that Rupert makes the top 15. I love a movie that can get the viewer to start saying stuff like, no he didn't, or no he's not, because that shows how invested your audience is. And The King of Comedy is the most no he's not movie I might have ever seen, which again, all comes from the roots that De Niro plants within this character. The scene where he shows up to Jerry's house has to be one of the most uncomfortable and hilarious moments ever put to screen. And if the performance doesn't work, this scene and the rest of the film film would fall apart. But because De Niro is so damn good, it heightens every other aspect of the movie. Famous comedian Jerry Lewis playing a famous comedian named Jerry really works here, because so many real people on the streets of New York were able to authentically react with their "Hey Jerry's" that felt like scripted scenes, but in reality were just part of the authentic Scorsese charm. It's too bad he absolutely hated every single moment of being on set. Sandra Bernhard is also incredible in this, and I don't think she hated working on this movie like Jerry Lewis did, so it's a shame Scorsese never had any other roles for her in the future, because for me, she is the best part of the film besides De Niro, and she cracks me up every time she shows up on screen. I love the way this story just keeps escalating itself as it goes along. What starts off as following a diehard fan slowly unravels itself into showing how fucking crazy Taylor Swift fans can be. I'm serious, you could argue that this is Scorsese's most relevant movie for this current generation. The way people obsess over modern celebrities has reached levels we never thought was possible with social media, and the way that is put on display here feels a little too accurate to how some people be acting out here. Some of Scorsese's work leans a bit more heavy on the entertainment side of things rather than thought-provoking, but the rest of his work tends to feel more thought-provoking than entertaining. But I think the brilliance of the King of Comedy is that it just feels like the perfect blend of both of those. I think you could sit down the most pretentious critic on earth next to some frat guy at the local college bar, and they will both have a great time with it. It's hilarious throughout the entire runtime, but also gives you moments to wonder if everything you are seeing is even real to begin with. It's one that people way smarter than me have analyzed a ton, but at the same time, I think it is still one that deserves a lot more love and recognition than it has received. In the history of my filmmaking journey, I have yet to find a 3-hour movie that flies by faster than The Wolf of Wall Street. There was a time in my life where I had a 14-hour flight, and I watched this twice in a row to kill 6 of those hours. I think it serves as a prime example of how a master of filmmaking remains a master of filmmaking no matter how old they get. Because the energy here feels like it's coming from a 25-year-old coming off a coke bender, even though Scorsese was 71 years old when this was released. I can't believe this movie is 10 years old already. Holy shit. I don't want to take too much time talking about this just because I feel like every other white guy on this site has praised everything about it already, but I agree with almost all the other white guys, okay? This is without a doubt Leo's best performance. In fact, as of right now, I don't think anything else comes close. He is a scary kind of good in this movie, and even though he was great in The Revenant, it did feel like the Academy was like, fuck, we should have gave it to him for Wolf of Wall Street. Here, let's give him this one. It might be a top 10 performance of all time for me. I'm dead serious. And the craziest thing is, he's not even the best part of the movie, because the pacing of this entire epic is completely unmatched by anything else out there. I agree, some 3-hour movies are a little too long for the story they are telling, but The Wolf of Wall Street doesn't waste a single second the entire runtime. What starts out as a fun, wild, corrupt ride somehow maintains that energy once the crumbling of this empire begins to fall down. Everything in this movie bounces off each other, getting amazing performances from people like Jonah Hill, Margot Robbie, and Jon Bernthal, who all do some of their best work. Matthew McConaughey is in the movie for like 5 minutes, and that character is still referenced in pop culture everywhere. A lot of critics say it's too over the top, but if the film doesn't even depict the craziest parts of Jordan Belfort's life, I don't see why that is such a big deal. Art doesn't need to be moral, it needs to tell the truth. This is a Martin Scorsese gangster flick in a different type of mafia, and the truth is there were and still are some shitty people out there that will take the average family's hard-earned dollar and give them an empty promise of becoming rich. Other critics say this film is dangerous for inspiring people to live a corrupt life like these characters, but I don't think it's the film's fault if those same people didn't comprehend the consequences that are depicted in the last whole hour of the movie. I've seen this at least 10 times, and I don't see that number plateauing anytime soon, because I think everything about this is just firing on every single cylinder. This top 3 is always switching around for me, so ask me on the right day, and I could easily put this at the number 1 spot. But for now, I'm gonna keep it below these 2. A lot of people say Scorsese peaked with Taxi Driver, and although I think sometimes they mean that as an insult, I think there could be potentially some truth to that. The dude is a legend that has made classic after classic, but Taxi Driver is a film so specific, so perfectly crafted, that it literally feels like the lightning that got caught in the bottle for independent filmmaking. A lot of people consider this to be the best film of the 70s and possibly the greatest achievement in American independent cinema, and I think I might have to agree with both of those things. I always really liked Taxi Driver, but as I got older and I kept rewatching it, I consistently keep moving it up my favorite movies of all time list. The film does an excellent job of capturing the origin of somebody losing their mind, how this country can just forget about somebody that comes home from a war they didn't even start, and how that lack of help can really turn somebody into a maniac. The feeling of masculine loneliness has never been depicted better than right here, because even though this guy is such a despicable human being by the end of it, he is painted in a way that makes you hold out hope for him the whole time, making you want him to change more than he actually wants to change himself. Again, it's hard to pick a favorite De Niro performance, and even though I think I prefer his work in The King of Comedy and Raging Bull, this is another one of the all-time great performances. In a way, this entire film relies on him being great, and no matter what scene he is in, he always surprises the audience in some sort of way, whether it be from a line of dialogue, a line from a voiceover, or just a simple hand motion of shooting at a movie theater screen. The entire story feels like one quiet breath being held, where you feel like some sort of bomb is going to go off, but you don't know when and where. And I think that part of the film gets scarier the more you realize it is so close to the type of world we live in today.
Every other person is like Travis Bickle now.
It really just feels like one of those rare, perfect movies. Incredible performances, incredibly shot, incredible music, incredible script in terms of both storytelling and dialogue. The way it looks at the gap between politicians and the common man is shown brilliantly in so many scenes, but the taxi ride with the candidate is my absolute favorite. People call this one of the best movies about New York, even though it captures the scummiest streets of the city, and I find all of that fascinating. It's one that every single time I watch it, I feel like I pick up on something I missed the last time around, whether it be a full-on detail or questioning if an aspect of the story is even real in the first place. A lot of Scorsese's staples like the vulgar language and voiceovers were all touched on a little bit before this, but Taxi Driver feels like the first time they really turned into a life of their own. I already mentioned the perfect script, but Paul Schrader still deserves a shout out regardless, because whenever he teams up with Scorsese, we always get something completely unique, even though I think their collaboration peaked right here. Some people might argue it's too boring, especially when you compare it to some of the other entries on this list, but from the bottom of my heart, I truly believe that this is not only one of Scorsese's best films still to this day, but I also think objectively it's one of the best of all time. Every time I ask myself, is Goodfellas really that good? I always give it a rewatch, and yes, it is that good. I know there's a lot of contenders for the best gangster media out there, but there's something about Goodfellas that always makes it my favorite. Usually I would say this is the director's most comfortable feeling movie, and mean that in a negative way, saying they fell a little too in their element so they didn't even try that hard, but I feel like this is Scorsese's comfortable director moment, and yet he still made it one of the best movies of all time. Just like Wolf of Wall Street and Taxi Driver, enough people have praised these movies for decades now, and it is probably the first movie somebody thinks of when they ask, what's your favorite Martin Scorsese movie? But it's rare that we get something this good and this timeless in any art form. Every time a Marvel fan says Martin Scorsese movies are just so boring.
If you're saying that the MCU is no substance and MCU movies are like roller coasters or theme parks, you could say that Martin Scorsese for sure. But then I think Martin Scorsese movies are like going to the DMV.
I'm convinced they have either only watched Marvel movies in their whole life or have never seen Goodfellas, because this is more engaging than anything with that red logo in front of it. And that's the brilliant thing about Goodfellas, because something like this should not be fun at all. It's based on a true story and depicts some truly awful people. But I think some of the most dangerous people to ever live were also some of the most charming, and it's the reason so many kids get sucked up into this dirty world in the first place. Ray Liotta as Henry Hill feels like the first role Leo would have gotten if he was old enough, but I think he is absolutely brilliant here. De Niro is great as always, don't get me wrong, but Ray had such a specific, scared yet tough energy to him that I really find Henry Hill to be one of my favorite movie characters ever, which is weird to say because he was a real person. Then of course you have Joe Pesci, and this is the movie where he really solidified himself as Joe fucking Pesci, but he is incredible in every single scene for the sake of being incredible, because clearly he didn't give a shit about his Oscar.
Well, it's my privilege, thank you.
Lorraine Bracco also plays one of my favorite characters from Scorsese's filmography. God, this movie's cast is just so stacked. Even Marty's mother gives her best performance here. The sets, the soundtrack, the fourth wall break, the iconic single take. All of it is just the cherry on top of an airtight script that doesn't waste a single second of your precious time. If a scene isn't funny, it's terrifying. If the scene isn't directly moving the story forward, it is building up something that will pay off an hour later. It's a film that completely summarizes who Scorsese was known for being, and even though he made a ton of films that are nothing like this in tone or setting, it is the one that will probably live on the longest to maintain his legacy. Some people may find it overrated, and that's okay. Some people have bad taste. That's part of the fun of talking about movies. But Goodfellas just feels like one of those universally loved films that is impossible to hate, and is one of the first I will be showing my kids one day when they really want to start getting into movies. Scorsese definitely makes my personal Mount Rushmore of favorite filmmakers, and even though a lot of the lower entries on this list contribute to that overall feeling, Goodfellas will always be the first one I think back to. And that is why still to this day, it remains in my top 10 favorite movies of all time. Thank you guys so much for watching as always. This is the longest video I might ever make. I mean, this was such an ambitious project. You guys have no idea, but I am so glad it's out and you made it to this part of the video. I am so happy I could say that. This is my social media here, especially follow me on Letterboxd if you want to catch up on there and talk about movies. If you made it to this part of the video, please like the video. I put so many hours into this, and giving it a like will really help me out with the algorithm and might help me make just a couple dollars off of it. So please do that if you made it to this part. I really appreciate it, truly. And if you really like the video, be sure to subscribe. My next director ranking is actually going to be David Fincher. I am hard at work on that one already. It will not be as long as this one just because there's not even half the amount of movies, but I will be working on that along with the Hayao Miyazaki one right after. So got a lot of great director ranking videos coming up. There's also the Christopher Nolan one already. So if you really like my thoughts on these movies, be sure to check out the Christopher Nolan video. The director ranking videos is just something I really love doing. Obviously I want to be a director myself, and going through some of my favorite filmmakers' filmographies is just a really cool thing to do, and talking about it with you guys. So be sure to comment down your list or even your top 10 Scorsese films. What's the one you really disagree with me on? What's one you really agree with me on? Did I sell you on checking out any of these other movies? Because I know there's a lot of people that haven't seen every single Scorsese movie. So let's talk about that all in the comment section down below. And I guess that's it. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an awesome day. Thanks.